Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and how India is proactively shaping a better world order. Viewers, this is a special episode focused on the extraordinary achievements of India's G20 presidency and its continuing legacy. And to discuss this, I have a very special and honored guest joining me in the studio, none other than India's G20 Sherpa and one of the leading voices and actors in public policy and public administration in India for many decades, Mr. Amitabh Kant. Amitabh Kant ji is the author of this important book. It's a blow-by-blow account of India's G20 presidency, how India scaled Mount G20. I strongly recommend this to you viewers because our discussion today is based on themes of this book. Amitabh ji, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Great pleasure being here.
Amitabh ji, one thing that struck me when reading the book is you spoke about a profound ideological shift that our presidency sought to bring about in the international community. So, highly divided world with lots of tensions and camps and rivalries, wars breaking out all around, and we had the presidency in 2023. You spoke about how Prime Minister Narendra Modi and our entire team were tasked with the difficult job of bringing about unity and sense of shared purpose. And you spoke about how we work to try and create a non-zero sum outcome and mentality among these 20 leading economies of the world. So I'd like you, if you can start by talking about how much this appeal to universalism and to shared values worked and why you think it worked despite the fact that it was a politically very fraught moment.
When we took over the presidency of G20, there were very many complexities. It was the post-COVID era. Vast segment of population had fallen below the poverty line in the world. Many people had lost their jobs. There was a crisis of climate action. Only 12% of the SDGs were on track. And there was a huge challenge of food, fuel, and fertilizer across the world. That was largely because of a major conflict which was on for over about a year and a half then. And the challenge for India was to bring all countries together. A multilateral forum works only when you are able to arrive at a consensus on all key issues. And the challenge for India was to bring G7, Global South, China, Russia, Saudi, Turkey all together and bring a consensus on all key issues confronting the world. That was a huge challenge at that point of time. But the Prime Minister wanted us to be very ambitious, very decisive, very inclusive and very forward-looking. And therefore, we pushed for an ambitious agenda. And he was also of the view that normally G20s are held in 1 or 2 cities. He said hold them in all states and union territories of India. So imagine hosting about 230 odd events in all states and union territories of India. The challenge of logistics was immense. We came out with flying colors. And the most important thing is that we were able to bring everyone together on key issues of balanced, sustainable, inclusive growth, on accelerating the implementation of sustainable development goals, on transforming the multilateral reform system, the digital public infrastructure, which was very critical, on a green development pact for the world, and also women-led development, which was a key perspective of India, to bring everybody together on all these key issues. India is the only country which has been able to achieve success on close to 112 outcomes in 88 different paragraphs. This extent of consensus on a very ambitious and inclusive agenda has never before been achieved. And particularly so because India was able to convert G20 into G21 and make it more inclusive by including African Union as a very integral member of the G20 movement.
Talking of African Union and the developmental agenda, now your book often refers to a very skewed international order that's been loaded against the Global South. And yet we managed to bring their concerns to the center stage, parallel to the G20, as soon as our presidency began, we also created the Voice of the Global South, another consultative mechanism for those who are not members of G20, but whose voices and interests must be brought to the table. So that aspect, I would request you to speak a little bit about that, because we were Voice of the Global South, and at one point in the book you say that we could not afford to let all these least developed countries down, because they were looking up to India to provide them leadership, because until then hardly anyone had cared, and G20 itself had gotten a reputation of being a power block of the very rich, which is G7, and the emerging powers, which are the remaining 12 or 13 countries. So what about the less developed and the weakest? And that element was part of our strategy from the beginning. Please talk a little bit about why we took on that role, that mantle of taking the Voice of the Global South to the G20.
So first and foremost, it's very important to understand that this year, 3/4 of the global growth is being driven by the Global South. For the next 3 decades, according to IMF, 70 to 75% of the growth will come from the Global South. And this will happen because the demographics in Asia and in Africa are young. The population in America, Europe and Japan is aging. So if these countries are going to grow, then you need international institutions which are tailored for their requirement, particularly the flow of the finance. When the institutions were constituted, the multilateral institutions were constituted post-World War II, there was no crisis of sustainable development goals, nor was there a crisis of climate action. And therefore, it's very important that we are able to speak the voice of the Global South. We are able to see that these countries are not the ones who have occupied carbon space. 84% of the carbon space has been occupied by the developed part of the world. When the opportunity for development comes to the Global South, they are being told that you circumscribe your development strategy because of climate action. Can you believe that in the global debt scenario, there are 42 countries who pay more on interest than they spend on health? And there are 23 countries who spend more on interest than what they spend on education.
As percentage of GDP.
Percentage of GDP. So these countries, if they have to grow, prosper, then you need a different world order. You need financial institutions to support their growth and development. Both the IMF and World Bank are not shaped for this reality. They are not shaped to raise private resources to make them flow to the Global South. And therefore, India took up the leadership position. India spoke the voice of the Global South, because for the first time, developing countries had the power to hold the pen. So far, the agenda of the world was being written by the developed world. This was the first opportunity for India to write a completely new, creative, constructive, and a positive agenda using the power of its pen. And that's what we did. We spoke the voice of the Global South. And the Prime Minister was clearly, because of his stature and standing, said that we must work together with the Global South. And therefore, we held several meetings of the Voice of Global South, bringing all these leaders together. And I think, to the great credit of India, I must say that if you read the G20 final New Delhi Leaders Declaration, that is a declaration which is almost speaking the voice of the Global South. And that is what India did. It became the voice of the Global South.
Absolutely. And it was a decisive turn, probably also because multilateral institutions had not really paid heed to their concerns, and we finally managed to bring them. And I suppose that process is now continuing, because once the New Delhi Leaders Declaration incorporated all these unique features for the Global South, it now became institutionalized. So that's a great achievement. Amitabh ji, the other interesting set of characters in your book, apart from the Global South, the poorest countries, are the emerging market economies. And you spoke about the coalitions that we built with a lot of these countries. You spoke about Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. So this set of countries, which are of course also in G20, but are not as rich as the G7 countries, are the most advanced. You have spoken about how there was a close unity of ranks among all of them and on most subjects. And this coalition was also instrumental in breaking the log jams you have shown in the book at different points. So let's talk a bit about these countries, which are all in the emerging market category. And why did we find such common ground with all of them? And why? One was, of course, the Troika, which, of course, we know the Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, they're all in a line. And so they were part of Troikas. But otherwise, why did we find common ground with these countries in particular? And what is it about the similar levels of development and the similar types of foreign policies you saw with these countries that aligned with India so much during our presidencies?
We could achieve success. We could achieve consensus because we were able to bring Brazil, South Africa, Saudi, Turkey, Argentina, Mexico, all together. They argued for us. We put them all together. And once in a grouping of 20, if about 12 countries are with you, then all emerging markets worked for India. Otherwise, we would not have been able to achieve consensus on such critical issues. And that is why, even on the geopolitical issue, where the United Nations had failed, where the Security Council had failed, all multilateral institutions had failed, India was able to arrive at a final declaration. It took us 300 hours of negotiation. It took us 250 bilaterals. 16 drafts failed. But we could succeed finally because all these other emerging markets stood with us and said that we want the world to grow with consensus. We want growth, but we also want peace. We want territorial integrity and political sovereignty, but we want progress on all the developmental agenda which India was pushing for. And that is what yielded us result. And it's very important. It's a lesson for all of us that in future, whether it's climate or any other issue, when we negotiate, India must be able to bring all the countries of the global south together. That gives you the power, that gives you the authority, that gives you the energy, the vibrancy and the dynamism to be the leader of the global south.
Absolutely. So, Amitabh, so far we spoke about the major structural dynamics, but I want to go to some of the key personalities that you also highlighted in the book. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, of course, the entire G20, the way we, accomplished everything had his hands, and he was the one pushing for this amazing outcome, and that is, of course, well recorded. You also spoke about External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar and how he also came in at different junctures to overcome deadlock. And you spoke about many instances with many countries with whom they were directly on the line at critical moments, and that helped to overcome, the stasis. So let's talk a bit about the role of our leaders in how they shaped the G20, and especially in these critical junctures and moments when all hope would have been lost because people were tired out from endless negotiation with no fruit. But then ultimately they were able to talk to their peers, their presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, their counterparts and foreign ministers, and make it happen. So that personal chemistry of our leaders, which is a kind of intangible social capital that they have, that they really utilized to the hilt during the G20 presidency, isn't it? And how crucial was that factor, and what does it tell us about India's stature in the world as a whole? You would have realized it during our presidency that prime minister's call to a president or a fellow prime minister would have meant so much, and that just shows our stature. So I'd like you to talk about our stature as it was reflected through the personal chemistry of our leaders.
First of all, it's very important to say that India's stature and standing has gone up enormously because of the leadership of the Prime Minister. I was only his Sherpa, and therefore I was acting on his behalf. Now, the Prime Minister's standing is very, very substantial. But more important than that is the fact that India has grown at rapid rates in the last few years. Its growth, its building up of infrastructure, its digital public infrastructure that it has built up, the technological quantum jumping that it has done, its ability to have provided houses for 40 million citizens, its ability to provide toilets to about 130 million people, to have provided piped water connection to 253 million citizens and to have built 88,000 kilometers of roads. All this adds to the stature and standing of the country. And to my mind, the great thing was that Prime Minister himself had a personal equation and a standing with all the leaders of the world. And even before we started the final round of Sherpa negotiations, he had gone for the ASEAN meetings, and he had gone earlier to the United States and many other places. So his stature and standing and his ability to have a personal equation with all the top leaders of the world mattered really and greatly to my mind. And secondly, I fully utilized that stature and standing to be able to get a consensus on all critical issues concerning the world. I used that to full advantage, and if it wasn't for that, we would not have achieved a consensus on the geopolitical para. Secondly, Mr. Jaishankar, he's a very dynamic minister with great foresight, with great vision, and every time I ran into a challenge, I fell back on him. I could always consult him. I could get his advice, his guidance at critical moments. And when we were negotiating the geopolitical para at one point of time, we were facing a challenge with Russia, which wanted a line on the sanctions, and which was not possible because speaking against the sanction would have meant that G7 would not have agreed. I consulted him, and he advised me on the strategy to be adopted. And I tell you that paid off very rich dividends, and that's how we were able to get Russia on board. And finally, we had to get United States and China on board, all of them. I was constantly taking his advice and guidance. He's been a very distinguished senior of mine, and I've greatly benefited from his inputs and foresight and vision.
Amitabh-ji, there were also the unsung heroes or the lesser known figures you have highlighted in the book. Our team, not just your core team, but hundreds and hundreds of you had so many consultants, researchers, people who are organizing all the events across the country, millions of people were involved in this. Now that force, and at one point in the book you say that they could actually bring out technically dense subjects to the table, and we went much better prepared. Generally, developing countries, as you know, in most of the multilateral institutions, we lack capacity, and we often go with one or two lawyers, and the Americans and the Chinese bring 50 or 100, right? So this time when we were hosting 2023, you showed that we actually had a strong intellectual base, and specialists on every topic who were feeding into the main process. Let's talk a bit about what that showed to the world as of India's capabilities and capacities. These, your bureaucrats and technicians and specialists and experts and organizers.
So first, there's no substitute for professionalism. There is no substitute for relentless hard work. And that would mean that you should be able to go back into history and say what stand has been taken by different countries and different multilateral forums at what point of time, and actually argue it out. Thirdly, you have to be bold, gutsy, courageous. And fourthly, be always optimistic. Never lose optimism. And lastly, build up a very strong team. And to my mind, the team that was built up in the G20 Secretariat, comprising of various colleagues of mine, was really an outstanding team. Many people came from outside. They all worked together as a team. And the credit for all this goes to the team which actually delivered this G20.
So now that the presidency is over, Amitabh-ji, I'd like you to take you to the present. You're still our Sherpa, and you're still participating in all the sessions leading up to the coming summits. So here, what is our legacy? You have listed many substantive legacies, and we've already spoken about some of them. I would like you to also speak a little bit generally about what is our legacy in terms of providing direction and overall leadership to the successive presidencies, the ones that followed us, and what you are seeing right now. I mean, for example, 2025, to what extent is the shadow of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration and the work that we did in 2023 still reflecting in the outcomes and the processes that are undergoing right now and into the future? Because ultimately, it was not just a one-off event, right? What we did was meant to be to have many carry forwards. So at present and into the future, how is Indian leadership still relevant? I mean, because people would want to know, okay, we hosted the summit and it was a very grand affair and the whole country awoke. But now what? I mean, after the presidency, how are we showing leadership?
So first and foremost, let me say that during our presidency, the definition and the framework of the digital public infrastructure was accepted by the world, that this is the model to grow. This is the model to take forward. And therefore, today, we are working with almost 30 countries on taking the digital public infrastructure to the rest of the global south. That's important. Number two, we redefined women-led development. This was the most ambitious para written in any multilateral forum, very distinct from gender equality. And to be able to bring every country together, from Saudi to Turkey to China, together on all this, was a very, very ambitious task for India, which is now being taken forward in the global agenda. Number three, to my mind, we've given a very, very major push to the transformation of multilateral institutions, thanks to the leadership of we had a report written by Mr. N.K. Singh and Larry Summer, which defined the requirement of finance for the global south, which is about roughly $3 trillion a year.
Is for climate, or generally?
Climate and sustainable development goals, both. 1.8 trillion for climate, 1.2 trillion for SDG goals. So that definition came in, and the multilateral institutions were tasked to raise those resources using private instruments and mobilizing many more private funds, which to my mind was a path-breaking moment. And fourthly, this huge focus on a green development agenda, that we will triple our renewable energy, we will double our energy efficiency, and we push for the biofuel alliance. And on the sidelines of the G20, if it wasn't for India, the next COP and the subsequent COPs would have all failed. The ambitious agenda was set by the G20 leaders here, and that could be taken forward. So that, to my mind, was very critical. We also brought center stage the critical issues of balanced and sustainable growth. We brought forward the task of rapid acceleration in implementation of SDG goals. But more than anything else, we made sure that African Union became a member of G20 under the leadership of our Prime Minister.
Absolutely. Last point, Amitabh ji, you have also mentioned this in the book somewhere about our domestic strengths and our vastly improved governance, and how that has also increased our respect in the G20 and the international community. And I'm reminded of Mahatma Gandhi's famous quote that, be the change you want to see in the world. So India is changing, isn't it? And the bigger picture takeaway from how India scaled Mount G20 for me as a reader was that India has changed, and therefore it is being taken more seriously, and therefore its leadership has higher weight. And whatever our Prime Minister says or our Sherpa says has more weight because of that reason. So you have, for a long time in your career, worked in domestic public policy matters in India, and you have seen the governance changes and improvements. Last word on that, and what should the world how should the world look at India in this context, that India is changing and therefore it needs to be taken more seriously?
So the important thing is that, we are a large economy of $4 trillion. We last year grew at about 8.2%. Our ambition is to be a $30 trillion plus economy by the time we become 100 in 2047. There are tough challenges for India because of geopolitics. There is a breakdown of global supply chains. There are new forces of production, artificial intelligence, quantum computing emerging. But this is a huge opportunity for India, to my mind. Huge opportunity to accelerate the pace of its growth at high rates for the next 3 decades, and to be able to transform the lives of vast segments of our population. And I think what we had achieved in the last decade under the leadership of the Prime Minister had inspired and motivated a lot of people. And the stature and standing of India had gone up very, very substantially. And that greatly helped us during our G20 presidency. There was positivity, there was optimism, there was confidence, and there was a perspective that India would provide good leadership which would be fair, just, and ambitious and inclusive. And that is what India did.
right? Viewers, this very, very enriching discussion with our G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, where he's talking about positivity in a time of despair and turmoil. Just think about it. I mean, just the audacity of hope, as one former US president wrote a book. This is exactly what we brought to the table, an audacity of hope. And more importantly, we had the strategy as well as the gravitas as a rising power that everybody wants to be on our side. And I think we used our strategic partnerships, our personal chemistry of our leaders, and of course our knowledge base and our specialists and expertise. All these came together to create a very successful G20 presidency, whose ripple effects are still being felt. And the story is not over. What Amitabh Kant is saying is that the carry forward of the things that we did, the miracles that we achieved, is still resonating in the global governance corridors, and that's how India has made a mark for itself as a leader. We are so proud of Amitabh Kant's achievements, and we wish that his G20 stewardship continues as Sherpa. Thank you so much, Amitabh ji, for sharing valuable insights.
Thank you. Greatly appreciate.
Viewers, this is Amitabh Kant's new book. Do read it. We spoke about it in the show. If we have whetted your appetite a bit about the book, there's a lot more in it from Rupa Publications, How India Scaled Mount G20. Do read it and do share your feedback. And the story, as I said, is not over. It is a continuing saga of India's rise on the world stage and in the multilateral arenas. And this is going to shape and remake the emerging world order. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.